just in case he's having some issues with that. I don't know.
Should we get started for those participants who we have here? Or
let's do that. Let's do that for sure. And
well, good afternoon, everybody across the country and possibly around the world for joining us today for this webinar. This is the second in our monthly Black History Month Civil Rights Field Trip series. The first one last week, we took you into the expanding American West with the Buffalo Soldiers in collaboration with the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum. And today we are going to explore the civil rights movement through the lens of equity and education. We are lucky to be joined today at TimeLooper with our partners from Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site. And I will now pass it off to today's facilitator, Rashida Wyndham from TimeLooper, to take it away from there. So Rashida, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, hi everyone, and I hope you all are doing well and safe, staying dry and possibly warm if you're in some colder, snowy climates like David is here today. So David, how would you just like to jump right on in? Or would you like to kind of give us a little bit of background about what you do with Little Rock Central High National Park Service?
For sure. I want to jump right in just a minute, but I'll go ahead and introduce myself a little bit more. My name is David Kilton, and I am what is called the Chief of Interpretation at Central High School National Historic Site. And that means I basically supervise all the operations around providing tours, giving educational programs, doing a lot of the special events and the volunteer program, running the visitor center at that site. And I've been working here for almost 4 years and with the Park Service for almost 14 years. And just love having the opportunity to be with you all today and be part of this program for sure.
All right, that sounds great. Okay, so let's just jump right on in. So we cannot start a conversation about Little Rock Central High School integration without explaining the context in which this event arose. In order to get to 1957, we have to trace our steps back to the end of the Civil War. So can you explain a little bit about those steps and how we got to 1957 Little Rock integration?
For sure, and even prior to the Civil War, we could go back to when the first slaves were brought into the country in 1619, and throughout the time period leading up to the Civil War, there was laws and rules that were established that did not qualify for all the citizens and individuals that lived within this country. And that included women, that included multiple different racial distinctions, but definitely the African Americans and those that were slaves. And amongst the battles of the Civil War, slavery was one of the foremost causes and reasons that those battles were fought. With the Emancipation Proclamation, there was freedom granted to some, but it was not to all. And there were even laws passed to try to provide for those freedoms. But as we proceed past the Civil War, there was continued resistance to allow those freedoms to continue, and eventually laws that were established that denied those freedoms, and even I guess you could say lied, saying that the separate and segregation provided equal freedoms and rights, but it did not.
Right. And okay, that sounds great. And thank you so much, David. And I would just like to say hi to Randy. This is our special guest today. So Randy, can you tell us a little bit about your involvement with Little Rock Central High School and just give us a little introduction?
Well, I'm sorry about coming in late, but having some technical issues. But yeah, I'm like you already know, I'm a park ranger there at Little Rock Central High School, National Historic Site, so I've been there for about going on 6 years. So I don't know what all you've been discussing so far, or what do you want, where you want me to come in at, or whatever.
So we were just talking a little bit about how we got up, what events led up to Little Rock Central integration, like what were kind of the contextualizing kind of that historic period?
Well, you know, first of all, I mean, what happened at Little Rock was it was in the making, and I generally start with the Emancipation Proclamation, and because that was, you know, my thing is to let people understand. Some people hear about the Little Rock Nine and they don't understand why why these Black kids want to go to that school. But there was a lot of things that led up to Little Rock that made this almost inevitable happening. And then started with, like I said, started with the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and Plessy versus Ferguson, where that was the first historic case where what was tried against separate but equal, and they deemed separate but equal was constitutional. And so then, you know, you move on down the road to 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education, that said separate but equal is inherently unconstitutional. And that's when that ball started rolling with this woman named Daisy Bates, who was the local NAACP leader in Little Rock. And she went to the school board to petition to have Blacks allowed into their schools. Well, a lot of the people don't know, Little Rock Central High School was the biggest school in the United States. It was the biggest, the best, the most expensive school. And it was for white kids only. And those white kids were allowed to have the best of everything, the best education, scholarships. And whereas the Black kids at the Black schools didn't have that. And so a few years, it took to 1957 before actual okay, we're going to let these Black kids go to this school. Well, by that time, Blacks in the neighborhood already knew what was in the school. They knew about the opportunities, and they wanted it because there were Black janitors and Black cooks that worked in the school, and they were telling the Black community what was in the school. So when those Black kids and those families found out what exactly was available, they wanted it. They wanted that education. And so they were bound and determined to get an education because the Supreme Court said they could. And so that's really what started all of this stuff, you know. So I was just trying to do it quick. I know we don't have much time, but is anything else you want to ask about it? Because there's a lot to this story.
There are more questions that I have,
Okay.
and both you and David and Randy, feel free to jump in. I'll ask you the questions together, and whoever wants to start off, just go right on ahead. So can you provide a brief overview contextualizing the Jim Crow South and the policy of separate but equal indoctrinated in the now famous Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case? I know people have heard of it, let's say, for example, over in a high level, that you said it just established the separate but and equal. But could you explain a little bit more about kind of how we got there, what was going on, kind of what, you know, started off this famous landmark case?
David, would you like to get it, or you like?
Yeah, for sure. So the policy of separate but equal, going back to Plessy versus Ferguson, basically, as Randy put very, very well, it was in 1896, the Supreme Court decided that if there were resources about how that separation was not, I mean, the equality in those resources was not there. And that was when my mother actually first came upon seeing that separation and that inequality. So she grew up in Pennsylvania, and when she was coming down to visit some family down in Alabama, they were outside playing. They went to go get a drink of water because they had gotten hot and they were all sweaty. And all these girls, all these white girls are sitting there waiting in line for this one water fountain. And my mom steps out of line because there's another water fountain sitting right there, kind of next to it. And that was not the same quality if you saw it. But she goes over and drinks out of that water fountain, and her cousins that are there playing with her flipped out and said, "What are you doing? Why are you drinking out of that water fountain? That one's for the coloreds." And I'm saying that in quotes because that's the term they used back then. And my mom said, I'm thirsty. I don't know what the big deal. There's a water fountain right there. Why can't I use it? And so it really was a shock to her to understand that there was this separation, and you did not break those lines. And that went not just to a simple water fountain, that went to restroom facilities, that went to where you could sit in a movie theater, it went to where you could actually shop, and even in some shops where they allowed for you, which actually Little Rock did for a time. They actually had some of these laws that where they were more progressive, and they went away from those laws. But even if you went into this shop that let those that were Black come in, you couldn't put on the clothes. You couldn't actually try those clothes on. And so those separations, and then we go into bus systems, transportation systems, and even traveling across the country, there were certain places, if you were of color or Black, you could not go into those facilities or use them at all. And so you just had to prepare or hope you could make it with your gas to that next place where they would allow you to take advantage of those resources and what they were providing, or you could actually eat there. And that was the situation. And as we come into the cases with Brown versus Board, one of the real elements that helped that decision to be a unanimous Supreme Court decision, that within education separation was inherently unequal and had to be stopped, was these doll tests that were done by Dr. Kenneth Clark and his wife Mamie. And to tell you what these doll tests were, is they would bring in children, all different ages, all different races, and they would have two dolls, one that was a white doll or a light complexion doll versus a dark or Black complexion doll. And they would ask simple questions, and asking these children, which is the nice doll, which is the pretty doll, which is the doll you'd want to play with, and then similar, which is the bad doll, which is the ugly doll, which doll would you not want to play with. And across the board, these children chose the lighter complexion doll and assigned it the better attributes versus the darker complexion doll. And that showed that this separation was causing these children, specifically the children of color, to not identify or prefer those that looked more like them. And that study was paramount, as Thurgood Marshall argued the case. As a lawyer for the NAACP, he argued the case and showed with that this separation was causing these ill effects and had to be stopped. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where once that decision was made, now there had to be a carrying out of desegregating. And I'm going to say desegregating instead of integrating. If you come to the site, we'll talk about this, and Randy can tell you about it too. This was not true integration. This is desegregating. So this is actually allowing a small amount of Black children to come into these schools to show, hey, we're bringing this about. But it was not true integration. And prior to Central High School, there are actually other places where desegregation had started. Even here within Arkansas, there were several schools that had already desegregated prior to Central, but Central is known as the first real big test within the South where this desegregation would happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Wow, that's amazing to hear. Randy, would you like to jump in and say anything?
Yeah, I coming from a person that lived through stuff here in the South, it's a whole different take on it. It's great when you hear about it in history, but to actually live through these times, it's a whole different meaning. And that's why I take this so seriously, because my job, what I try to do is to have people empathize, to put them in those situations. Because as a little Black boy growing up here in Arkansas, and I was born in 1964, so I grew up through this at the end, kind of like the end of this stuff. And like David was saying, that's separate but equal. You knew where you were supposed to be or where you wasn't supposed to be. And that was the big deal. And so when you look at this whole integration or desegregation, you're talking about former slaves, descendants of slaves, and now their kids are actually wanting to go to school with white kids. That's where the pushback came here in Little Rock, because they didn't want these black kids to get this great education. And so to want to get an education and can't, it's hard, you know. So David explained it real well, you know, but when you go to stores and you can't try on clothes, or your parents have to take a string that's big enough to go around your waist so that they could put that string around those pants to see if you could actually wear those pants. Just imagine that. And so what I try to do is try to put people in those situations. What if it was you? What if this was your child? What if you wanted to get an education and couldn't? And so that's why I really enjoy being here at the site, because there's a lot to, you know, I know we don't have very much time, but it's kind of hard to put it all in a short period of time. But growing up, going through it, living through it, it's a lot different than just reading about it. Right. And I really don't know what else to say about it, because I could go on and on and on and on, but I try to cut back right now.
Right. And I think it's really important to highlight to those that are watching that this is happening with people that are still alive. This is only happening, you know, a few decades, generation or two ago. So while we say like these issues are important and they're still continuing to happen, it's important to see. And Rainey, I'm grateful that you're able to bring that experience here to show that, you know, we're it wasn't so far long ago.
And another thing I like to get people to understand, that these are actual people. They wasn't just people that you read about. These people, all of them except for one of them, is still alive. And so these people are sharing stories about what happened to them and their experiences and their families' experiences. So it's important that we get the real story, you know, because like I said, this was more than just 2 paragraphs in a history book.
Right.
Exactly. This was a long time, and it's still happening in some other forms, sometimes not as blatant, but it's still happening.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's see, to push a little bit further. So let's see, could you, so going, oh, that's like, sorry. Let's see, let's move a little bit forward and talk about the next court case that really affected integration or desegregation of school. So can you please tell us about the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, and kind of how that changed everything?
David? David is more eloquent in his speaking sometimes than I.
So what was being argued, and actually we refer to it as Brown versus Board, but there were multiple cases that were included in the problems of segregation within education. And that was the main focus of this argument that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's called Brown because that last name actually ended up alphabetically the first in order of the other students that were included in that case. So if you can imagine, you are being bused past multiple schools to go to your school. All the money that's being spent, your school is nowhere near the same opportunity. And we've kind of already brought this up a little bit, but to highlight that, your books were often hand-me-down books. Your facilities might be a one-room house that you're meeting in instead of a real school campus with playgrounds and multiple teachers and things like that. In those hand-me-down books, unfortunately, you might have, because the students that used them the year before knew they were coming to this segregated school where these Black students would be thought of as unequal or insignificant. These books would be defaced. Sometimes they would have terrible things written in them and be in just worn, terrible condition. But these were what you had to work in. Now I'm gonna highlight one of the differences specifically with Central High School. The biology labs had microscopes. Now today that might not sound like a big deal, but back then that was a huge resource that most schools did not have. They taught higher level math, they taught higher level sciences. They actually had multiple foreign language classes, including Latin and things like that, where you could go on to become a doctor, you could go on to become a lawyer, and all these other jobs and professions that often at the segregated Black schools, they're teaching courses like sewing or brick masonry and things like that. So the opportunity that you were going to have from just the education that you were provided was very limited. And so seeing those differences, this court case comes about, and it's argued at the highest level. And as I mentioned, Thurgood Marshall was the head lawyer for the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He was the head lawyer, and he brought very effectively the Clark's doll study and other elements showing that the separate was a problem, but also the equality was not there. And so he argued so effectively that it was a unanimous decision. All of the Supreme Court justices voted to end segregation. And now when it had to be implemented, it was kind of left up to the states themselves to figure out how this would happen. If we touch in on the story in Little Rock, there was hesitancy. There actually was a plan that was set up by the superintendent. His name was Virgil Blossom, working with the school board and the leaders within the community of Little Rock. Now, I'm going to step aside for just a minute because Little Rock was thought of to be fairly progressive at the time. They had already integrated or desegregated their bus system. They had desegregated a lot of their stores. So there was a lot of opportunities and resources that were available for the Black community here that were not available in other states throughout the South. In fact, Little Rock was growing about the same rate as Atlanta, Georgia at the time, had about the same population, had a lot of opportunities that were coming about. And there was a hope that maybe Little Rock would take over after the Civil War as the new progressive capital of the South. Now we come to the events that would happen here with the desegregation of Little Rock. And what would happen with Virgil Blossom, the plan that the superintendent set up, that it was not providing for the desegregation at a quick enough level or a quick enough pace. So they actually had further arguments that came into place. Thurgood Marshall actually was representing the Little Rock Nine and the other students that were trying to desegregate and integrate into Little Rock school system, and specifically Central High School. And so he argued, and eventually another ruling came down from the Supreme Court called Brown 2, which basically said that they needed to push forward with these integration plans with all deliberate speed. Now that doesn't tell you how fast or what not that was supposed to happen, but they were supposed to start moving. And so eventually it was decided that the first place that they would desegregate would be at Central. And I think that actually has a lot of significance, is because if you take other places where the desegregation happened, a lot of times they started at grade school level. So they're starting with younger kids. Mm-hmm. I think starting at the high school level is one of the reasons we would come to the kind of unrest and the problems that would happen with Little Rock, is because as these children got older and lived within this society of separation longer within their lives, they would have generated their own understanding of how if you're white, you're better, or you deserve more, or than those Black students. Or if the other thing that comes into play is a lot of times in grade school, you're not going to have another issue that might take place is what if these students that integrate Central High School start to become friends with the all white student body? Those friendships might develop into something more. And there was a huge fear of, at high school level, what if they develop romantic type engagement with each other? So that was another factor of huge fear and pushback against having this happen at that level. Now, I'm not saying all the integration at grade school level were beautiful and great. If you take Ruby Bridges' story or other things like that, but those kids and the elements that were there, I don't think were as significant of a factor in those other cases.
Wow, it's really, really interesting. And again, like Randy's saying, you're not reading about these in the history books. So Randy, could you offer your take on it as well?
Yeah, my main thing is my personal experiences. That's, I think, my strong suit in this whole story is growing up here, knowing about what happened here through my family, because of course I'm from here, and being able to tell the story now, you know, to the newer generations. But David, I mean, he puts it all out there. He puts it real well, better than I can. I mean, I tell the story. I'm a storyteller. David is more of a historian. He knows, you know, he really knows how to put it. But my own experiences is what I go off of. And growing up and going to school, being part of that, like he said, the Blossom Plan. The Blossom Plan was a plan that was supposed to be in increments. And so when it got to the elementary part of this plan was in 1972. And so that's when I came into the picture. I was bused about 12 miles away, like David said, passing schools along the way to get to my school. And then when you really think back, and a lot of times when we're doing these tours, and a lot of people will say, well, why did those parents let those kids go to those schools? Why did you have to go so far away? When you really think about it and look at it, what white parent is going to send their kids into a Black school and without busing? And because the schools wasn't as good. And so they were trying to make it, I guess, so that everybody could get an equal education. So therefore I had to travel so far away to go to school. And once I was at that school, it was only 3 of us there. And our experiences were horrible. I was in the 3rd grade and going to an all-white school in the country, what people call a redneck school. And there was a lot of racism there. And they let you know that you wasn't welcome. Things like, I'm in the 3rd grade, couldn't play on the playground because the older kids would beat you up or hurt you. My recess consisted of me and a friend of mine named Joseph Rice. Our recess was sitting on the school, on the ground with our backs against the walls, watching the other kids, watching the white kids play, and then getting beat up. And so my dad got really upset about me coming home every day, bruised up, hurt, crying, upset, you know, until he sent me to school with a table leg one day, and he was like, if anybody hit you, touch you, you hit them. I mean, that was the only way that, I mean, he didn't know what else to do, but well, what can you do? You know, you're trying to go to school and these kids are tormenting you. And just imagine that at a high school level. You're talking about young adults, and they are very vile. They're very, I mean, the stories are horrendous of the things that happened to these 9 kids just trying to get an education. And then, you know, you have the aspect of the teachers. I mean, are they going to really help these Black kids? Are they really going to teach these Black kids? So there's a lot of different sides to this story. And That's about as much as I can say on the right now. Like I said, I don't know how much time we have, so I'm trying to.
Let's see. Um, I think if, since we started a little bit late because of the technical issues, if you guys don't mind maybe hanging around for maybe another 20 minutes for those that have to go, that's totally fine. It'll be available again for recording so you can watch the discussion afterwards. So yeah, Brandy, thank you so much for those experiences that you have. And again, it's almost like thank you for your service because essentially you're bearing the brunt of what I have not experienced. I went to a majoritively white school, but I never experienced any type of bullying or physical violence to this aspect. I felt relatively safe. Felt like I was getting a quality education, and so I like to thank you again for that. So let's discuss kind of on September 5th. So in our previous discussion with Captain Matthews at the Buffalo Soldiers National Park, we discussed how education was a motivating factor for African American men to enlist in the Army under the Buffalo Soldiers. I just can't help but to notice that education is an important motivating factor throughout African American history and Black history. So what are your thoughts and how was access to equal education a motivating factor for the initial wave of students integrating?
I think it's very important. That was the ultimate, that was the utmost, that was the most important part of the story. And these kids wanted an education. And these Black teachers at their schools were teaching these Black kids really well because they knew that these kids had to be competitive maybe one day in life to try to have a better way of living. So they almost demanded that these kids were to learn, and they did it with less equipment. I mean, like David said, with the microscopes or stuff like that. These kids, like all of their equipment, everything came from the white schools, and I you imagine. Some of the I remember I can't remember which of the Little Rock Nine I was talking to. They were saying how their books they wouldn't even have covers on them. They've been and ripped the covers off of them, and the teacher would um, take cardboard to it so they would have a cover. All of their the typewriters and stuff that was coming from the other schools were missing keys off the typewriters. Desks were missing legs. Their football equipment, the helmets didn't have pads in it because these kids were actually physically taking the stuff and tearing it up. But these kids were so determined to be professionals. You know, Ernest Green wanted to be an engineer. Minnie Jean, she wanted to sing opera. They didn't offer these courses at the black schools. So now here you are, here you have a school right up the street that the Supreme Court said you could attend or you wanted to go. And they were bound and determined. Carlotta Walls said once they bombed her house to try to keep her from going, she was more determined to go to school now. And so you have to understand the level of importance that education played to these Black parents, even to my parents. My family come from sharecroppers on my mama's side of the family. One of my great uncles was on my dad's side was one of the first Black legislators in Arkansas. So that side of the family, they were stressing education. And my side of the family, they was just saying, hey, get a job, get you, be able to make money for your family. But education played the biggest role. I joined the Marine Corps. Why? Because I wanted a better education. I wanted to go and educate myself and be better than my mom and my dad had it. So that was a driving force. So yeah, it was the driving force behind these kids going to school. And there's no other reason, because they had their own education. They could have just went to their own school, but they wanted better education. And so that's why I think it's very important that I stress to anybody, especially when I'm talking to students, education, education, education. Because once you get it up here, can't nobody take it away from you. And so that's the same mindset I think that those black families had at that same time. And it's been that way for forever, I guess, since Blacks learned to read. You know, first got to understanding how to spell and stuff like that. We just took off and just want to learn more and more and more. And so, yeah, education is the best. It's the only way. You know, it's the most important part of it.
All right, that's great, and thank you so much. So David, I'd like just to ask you, could you give us like a brief timeline of kind of the events that folded on September 5th for Little Rock?
Yes, and if you don't mind, I'm going to take you back for just a minute to highlight something that Randy was just talking about. So when the opportunity came to go to Central, they actually went to the segregated Black schools at that time to see who would volunteer to come. And these are these students that Randy was just talking about that are being trained and given amazing opportunities and amazing level of education from the school's teachers with the resources they had, preparing them for this opportunity. So we talk about the Little Rock Nine, but initially over 200 students volunteered to go to Central.
Wow.
So how do we get from 200 to 9? So this goes back into the steps leading up to September 4th. And if you asked the school board, if you asked the superintendent, if you asked the leaders within the community, specifically the white leaders is who I'm talking about, how many they wanted to go, you could almost fairly say that they didn't want any, but this was being forced upon them. So they set up rules to cut the number that would go. And the first rule that they established was that those students had to have almost perfect grades and perfect attendance. This cuts the number by about half. The next rule that they would set up is that these students had to commit to not participate in any extracurricular activities. The Brown versus Board decision said that for education, it didn't say for all these other extracurricular activities. So those students were going to come for an education and that's all. Now, when I say extracurricular activities, I'm saying they couldn't be in band, they couldn't be in choir, they could not participate in any sports, they could not go to any dances, they could not go to any pep rallies, anything like that. So this was a huge blow if you consider some of the places where barriers were being broken at this time. You can take Louis Armstrong, you can take Thurgood Marshall himself, you can take Jackie Robinson. And so these individuals that were really kind of making a dream and making a way for themselves were inspiration for these kids. Actually, some of the 9 talk about how Carlotta Walls, I'll bring out in particular, she remembers going and watching Jackie Robinson play within the Negro League and just was so amazed at his abilities and was excited when he got that opportunity to go on and play and be the first African-American to be brought into Major League Baseball. So this again cuts a huge number of the students. The next thing that would actually be set up as a rule is that they had to commit to what we call the Jackie Robinson principle. If you're familiar with Jackie Robinson, when he went in to desegregate Major League Baseball, he was told that he could not retaliate no matter what was done to him. If fans or other players or his own teammates or managers or anybody spit on him, threatened his life, hit him, did anything like that, he committed to not retaliate. That was amazing bravery. And he had to go through amazingly difficult experiences to continue to pave the way and provide for that opportunity for others. Now that's a grown man. These students coming into high school to just gain an education had to commit to the same thing, that no matter what was done to them, if their books were stolen and defaced, if their lockers were broken into and befouled, which happened, if they were pushed down the stairs, if they had food dumped on them from higher levels in the school as they were just walking up and down the stairs, no matter what happened, and I can tell you all the things that I just mentioned happened to the 9 as they went to Central High School. They could not retaliate. So they had to commit to that. Eventually they brought down, they had to be interviewed by the superintendent, Virgil Blossom, and see if they weren't troublemakers and they fit the mold of who they wanted to be. So this cut down to where we only had 17 students left out of the over 200. Those 17 students' names, addresses, and phone numbers were published in the local newspapers, saying these are the kids that are going to go to Central. You can imagine what happened to those families when that news got out. They were threatened. Jobs were threatened. Actually, some of the parents or grandparents had their bosses come to them and say, hey, I hear your daughter, granddaughter, grandson's planning to go to Central. If you want to keep getting a paycheck, that's not happening. Mm-hmm. So this cuts down to final 10 that show up on September 4th. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of worry about what might happen, a lot of protesting going against the desegregation of the school. In fact, first day of class was September 3rd. The 9 didn't go that day, or the 10 didn't go that day because they were afraid that violence might break out. So they actually let school happen that first day, and the mob that showed up, really, they made a lot of noise in the morning and then just dispersed. So there wasn't a lot that happened on the 3rd. So they said, okay, sounds like everything's going to be good. Let's bring the 10 in on September 4th. So there was a plan in place. The students were supposed to come on buses or walk to the school, and then actually not bring their parents because they were afraid if the adults came that it might cause more violence if there was adults seen. So they were supposed to come on their own. Well, over the night, actually, Governor Faubus interrupted primetime TV. TV's brand new at this time, and said that he heard that all the guns and knives within the city of Little Rock had been bought up, and he was afraid for the citizens of Little Rock and that blood would run in the streets. So to protect those citizens, he was going to bring in the National Guard. Now, this actually brought some level of comfort to some of the 10 students and their families, because they're like, oh, the National Guard's going to be there. They'll help to keep the peace. Well, unfortunately, the National Guard was not there for them. They were not fully considered citizens, you might say, at that time. So the National Guard was there under the orders to keep them out. But because of some of the unrest, going back in the story just a minute, Daisy Bates actually called and said she was kind of worried about the plan, and they switched up the plan the night before the September 4th when they come. And what she told them to do is all meet at her house, and they were going to walk to the school together with 4 pastors. Actually 2 African-American pastors and 2 white pastors were going to walk with them together in solidarity to help them get to the school safely and get in. Unfortunately, not everybody got a call. Some of the students didn't have, or their families didn't have phones. One of those students was Elizabeth Eckford. She did not get the call that night. So she comes on the morning of September 4th, following the original plan, gets off the bus on 13th Street that's just down the hill from where the school is, walks up the hill, and there's actually a buzz from the crowd that's there. Not only is it all just the segregationists and protesters, it's families of the white students that are there trying to see how things are going to play out. A lot of them would have been part of the mob of segregationists. It's also a lot of reporters that are there from all over coming to cover this story. Well, as she comes up the hill, she notices that some of the white students that had already been there the day before are walking in through one of the side doors of the school. Seeing the large mob gathered out there, as a young 15-year-old girl, she's like, I don't want to be any part of that. I'm going to go in this side door where all the other students are going. But as she approaches that door, the National Guard steps in front of her and bars the way, will not let her go through. They don't talk to her much. They actually don't, not even at all. So eventually she goes to the corner, and this is where you see some of the first pictures of that morning, is her at the corner with one of the National Guardsmen just pointing down the road. Once again, not talking with her. And she's thinking, oh, I have to go to the front of the school to get in. Well, she continues down the school. Now the media has gathered around her and starts to take interest, taking pictures. This draws the attention of the segregationist mob protesting. They start to gather around. She tries to step up onto school grounds multiple times, walking down that street to get to the front of the school, barred every time by the National Guardsmen. So she has to just face the fear, terror, and just onslaught of this mob of protesters. Eventually, when she gets to the front of the school, is one of the first times the National Guards talks with her and lets her know, by order of the governor, you will not be allowed into the school. And that's when she realized she is stuck there with this mob surrounding her, and she has to find a way out. At that point, she sees a bench down the street that is another public city bus bench. And she says, if I can, in her mind, she said that day, if I can get to that bus bench, I'll be safe. So she continues down the street. It's actually about 2 blocks to walk down this whole street in front of the school. She continues down, sits on that bus bench, and waits for the bus to come and pick her up. Some of the emotion gets to her during this time, and this is actually when some individuals step in to try to help her out in her plight. During that time frame, the other students have come with Daisy Bates and the pastors, and they're told right off by order of the governor they will not be allowed in. So they actually turn away and leave. Daisy Bates actually has one of the news reporters help her out that morning, a man by the name of Benjamin Fine. He actually sits down, has a young daughter about the same age, and he sits down when he sees her kind of breaking down, tearing up, puts his arm around her and says, don't let him see you cry. He is actually harassed because he had that moment of compassion and reached out to try to help her on that morning. One of the other 9 actually tried to help Elizabeth that morning. Terrence Roberts came and he said, let me come with me and we'll get out of here. I'll get you away safely. Elizabeth didn't know Terrence very well and was afraid if they got away from the crowd, away from the school where all the media was, maybe they would be in more serious trouble where things could be hidden about what attacks might have happened to them. So she doesn't go off with Terrence. Daisy Bates' husband, Elsie Bates, he tried to help her. He actually showed that he had a gun and said, hey, I can protect you. She didn't know Elsie really at all. And she was always taught not to go anywhere with strange men. So she didn't go off with Elsie. Eventually, Grace Lorch actually steps in, a white woman, and she actually yells out at the crowd that they'll be ashamed of what they're doing. And this is a young girl, and they need to leave her alone. And of course, she's harassed for what she does. One last individual that helped her out that morning that she didn't realize for almost 40 years is the National Guard commanding officer asked one of his soldiers to go over and stand behind the bench and keep the crowd back. She never saw that National Guardsman there. So 40 years later, she saw a picture and realized that one of the guardsmen was there. Wow. Protecting her from physical harm, although not from the verbal abuse and other things that she received that day. After those events, they would have to go back to court battles for 3 weeks and eventually would not have an opportunity to get back into the school until September 23rd.
Okay, if I could just add something while he stepped away real quick. What I want you to understand that this is a 15-year-old little girl.
Right.
And she's facing a mob of 600 to 700 angry white people. And she's sitting there and she's thinking these guards are there for her. And so she's just lost. And these people aren't just yelling, they're spitting on her, they're in her face. She's terrified and she's trying to show dignity. She's trying to hold her head up and walk. And Elizabeth says, by the time she sat at that bus bench, that dress that she had on was so covered in spit, you could wring it out.
Oh, wow.
That's to show the level of hatred that little girl was faced on that day, all alone. And so these are the stories that we tell. And we want people to understand, in that bus that she came to school on, that wasn't a school bus. They told them they wouldn't allow them school buses. They wouldn't be afforded school buses. She rode the city bus to school. And so, yeah, so that's how she got to that school. And yeah, so just try to imagine that, being the only person of your color, white, black, whatever the case may be, just being the only one, and you're only 15 years old. And all of these people that don't look like you hate your guts. and they're spitting, they're cussing, they're shoving, they're kicking, and you're all alone. So that's what makes this story so powerful, because they were doing all this just to get that education.
Right. Okay. So I know that maybe we have time for about one more question. So it's pretty like a general, broad question. But what was the lasting legacy of the Little Rock Nine, and how did they affect the trajectory of the civil rights movement? That's one. Actually, I'll just throw in another one. And so how would you assess the state of education equity today? Let's say, for example, if you can give me like a few points about maybe where we're lacking, where we're progressing, and maybe what educators that are listening now, what they can do in the classroom as well.
Well, if I could just add one thing, that the Little Rock Nine left an impression was, how they made an impact was me. Because of the Little Rock Nine and do what they did, afforded me the opportunity to do what I'm doing right now. To tell this story, to tell it honestly. And I talked to Minnie Jean. I was with Minnie Jean for a week one time. And I told her about how some of the people don't like how I tell the story. And she asked me, well, how do you tell the story? And I told her, I gave her my whole spiel. I told her what I tell people, and I don't hold back when I tell the story. And Minnie Jean looked me in my eyes and she said, don't you change a word, because that's what happened. And that's what people need to know. We can't whitewash this story. You know, we have to tell it. I went to a workshop, and one of the things they said, they asked us that when you're trying to tell the story, how do you tell the story? Just tell the story. And so that's one of the things that I find comforting for me, is that I'm telling the story, I'm taking the story on, I'm moving it forward, and helping people to understand what happened. And a lot of times, you know, we try to kind of hold back a little bit sometimes, and it's really not good to do that, in my estimation. And the way I see it, I think it's best to just tell it, and because it's what happened. It's not my story, it's his story.
Right.
You know, so I missed the second part of your question, though. You had.
So it was just like, how would you assess the state of education equity or equality today? I know that we are progressing. For example, like you, Randy, you're afforded this great education, which allows you to be in your position now. I'm pursuing my PhD at Howard University currently. So we're basically walking in the steps of Little Rock, and I can gladly say that I'm a progenitor of what they were able to endure. So would you say, like, what would you say that there are kind of our pitfalls that maybe we, as us people today and the educators that are listening, maybe what could they do to possibly further this education equity? I think first, what you were saying is telling the story truthfully. I think that's always important, but maybe you or David, another example of maybe what we can do. Yeah.
David?
So one of the things I would definitely reflect on is, besides the nine, there were the individuals that came after, and Randy's a perfect example of this. Another great example that we interact with quite a lot is a woman by the name of Sybil Hampton, Dr. Sybil Jordan Hampton. And she was the first student to attend Central all 3 years and graduate as a senior. And that would be the year after they closed all the schools for a full year after Ernest Green graduated, and that first year passed by. And one of the things that she mentioned after hearing about some of the issues that sprang up within this last year, of civil unrest and inequality and things that we still see within our country, and I could easily say around the world. And what she said is, you'd hope we would be farther, but realize we're not in the same place we were before. And I think that's something to recognize, is that we've made steps in the right direction, but there's still progress that needs to happen, and we need to acknowledge that and not give up. And with that is, we need to be open to those other stories. We need to be open to the full spectrum of history, and realize that just the way we've told it in the past may not, because that was the way it was told, doesn't mean it's always the right way. And there are other stories that are powerful, that are important, and we need to give traction and credibility to those stories and see the value in all of them. And that really is a reflection of, I feel, where we might need to go with education going forward. And one of the places that stands out to me is we provide a platform. And I know sometimes within a school, it might be more difficult to tell all of the stories in the amount of time you have and things like that, and the regulations you have to teach with your curriculum or to a test or whatnot. But there are opportunities like what we're doing right here where you can engage more fully with what the story is, besides, as Randy's already brought up, the 2 paragraphs that might be in your school book about the story of Central High, and really trying to fully engage with the full account of those stories provides a great value to within our education systems. And if we look for those opportunities and take advantage of them as much as possible, I think it's going to be worth its weight in gold in the amount of time and effort we put to give that opportunity within the education system and to our students today.
Oh, that's great. That's
Well,
really
great.
great. Okay. So unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but thank you both, David and Randy, for being here and talking with us today. Just as a plug, TimeLooper does have a virtual field trip with the Little Rock Central National Park Service, and we'd love for you guys to be able to visit, as well as download the app. Listen, it's I've actually went through the experience, and it's fantastic. So and also for those that are watching, thank you so much for sticking around with us. We do have another civil rights virtual field trip going on next Thursday, February 18th. Wow. With 16th Street Baptist Church and Bethel Baptist Church. So we'd love to all see you there as well. And again, thank you, David and Randy, for being here and offering some wonderful insight. It's been amazing.
You're welcome.
So
Thanks for having us.
I know.
Randy, thank you.
Yes.
Rashida and Andrew, we thank you. And all you teachers and students, we are glad to be with you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank y'all.
Okay, and you guys stay safe and warm.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.